Welcome to the channel. Tonight, let us open the door of time and journey back to meet one of the most enigmatic and proud figures in European history, Queen Elizabeth I, the woman who never married, never had children, yet ushered in an entire era that now bears her name. From a childhood shrouded in darkness to the moment she wore the crown in a world fraught with danger, Elizabeth did not merely survive. She transformed herself into a legend. This is a story of fear, wisdom, resilience, and a heart that carried the weight of an entire kingdom. So, before you let yourself drift into the ancient flow of time, do consider subscribing to the channel if this story truly resonates with you. It is the only way I will know that you are listening and cherishing every shared moment of storytelling. You are also welcome to leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what time it is there. It is always fascinating to see the map of listeners from around the world coming together in the same quiet moment like this one. Now then, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a small fan to add a gentle background breeze, and let yourself be swept into the story of a woman who chose a life of solitude so that England could remain strong forever. Have you ever heard the whisper of a secret buried for nearly 500 years? A story that begins not with the brilliant light of a throne, but with the heavy silence in a birth chamber within a palace where the River Thames flowed quietly. In September of 1533 at Greenwich Palace, a slender crescent moon hung suspended in the misty sky above England's waters. Autumn winds drifted through cold stone corridors, carrying the faint scent of firewood, medicinal herbs, and anticipation. Inside the palace, oil lamps burned dimly. Servants moved softly like ghosts, and outside guards gripped their pikes tightly. The King Henry VIII paced in his private chamber, his heart burning like a red-hot coal. After years of yearning for a male heir, after discarding his past again and again, he had pinned all his hopes on his second wife, Anne Boleyn, a woman who was intelligent, beautiful, and bold. A gamble watched by the entire realm. Then, a cry rang out. Not the triumphant roar of victory, but the fragile, tender sound of a baby. Not a prince, but a little girl. Elizabeth. In that moment, the entire palace froze. No triumphant drums, no thunderous cannon fire. Only the looks of disappointment passed among the courtiers. A baby girl. Not an heir. Merely a misstep of fate. Yet if one was sober enough to approach the cradle, they would have seen in that baby's eyes a sharpness like a razor and hair as fiery red as flame. A child who carried the noble Tudor blood and the fierce will of her mother, a woman who had upended all of England. No one realized in that instant that England's destiny had shifted, because the baby born to disappointment would become one of the greatest queens the world has ever known. However, Elizabeth did not grow up cherished. Before she turned 3 years old, her mother Anne Boleyn was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and executed on charges of treason and adultery. A cold steel blade ended the life of one who had been queen. And Elizabeth, orphaned by her mother in a political turnabout, was declared illegitimate. Her title as princess was stripped away. Her royal life vanished like smoke. From that moment on, she was removed from the heart of power, moved from household to household, living amid fine silk, yet devoid of affection, observed more than embraced. But in that silence, a fire began to burn. Elizabeth did not struggle outwardly. She listened. She watched. What others spoke merely to endure, she remembered to survive. She soon understood that in a place where a single misjudged glance could lead to ruin, silence itself was the strongest shield. As queens came and went, like passing winds, some dying, some driven away, Elizabeth, the red-haired girl, sat and watched, eyes wide, asking no questions, offering no complaints, only learning. And then they discovered that her mind was a treasure. She apprenticed in Latin, ancient Greek, French, and Italian. She read Cicero, Seneca, the Holy Bible, and classical poetry. She possessed a keen intellect, a tenacious memory, and a peculiar talent, empathy without words. She did not simply study, she absorbed. She did not merely live, she forged armor out of every wound. They say a king is born to rule, but Elizabeth was not born to reign. She was born to be forgotten, cast aside from the bloodline of power. And because of that, she learned to survive where many had lost their heads through prudence, through intellect, and through solitude. Alone, but not weak. A little girl, but not ornamental. By her teenage years, Elizabeth had grasped what many spend a lifetime chasing. Power is not something to love, but something to command. And within the thick fog of her childhood, when darkness covered every fracture in the royal house, she refused to be consumed. She transformed the darkness into her crucible. When everyone assumed Elizabeth was merely a forgotten footnote of history, it was precisely then that she was writing the first chapter of her own age. An era that no one, even Elizabeth herself, could have imagined would shine so brightly. Night fell cold over the skies of London, like a curtain concealing fears that had no name. The wind slipped through the ancient stone walls of the Tower of London, dragging with it echoes of forgotten footsteps. And in the place that had devoured so many royal ambitions, a young woman sat awaiting her fate. Not everyone can understand that feeling, to be imprisoned in your own country with the blood of royalty running through your veins, to be accused of treason without ever drawing a sword, and to be surrounded by those who speak in gentle whispers, yet look at you as if you are the enemy. In the year 1554, when a rebellion erupted to overthrow Queen Mary, it did not take much for fingers to point toward Elizabeth, the half-sister, the Protestant girl, the potential heir, and above all, the suspiciously silent one. Elizabeth was escorted into the Tower of London, the very place that had once held her mother, Anne Boleyn, before she was beheaded. The damp stones beneath her feet were not merely cold, they seemed to whisper, "History repeats itself, little girl." In those days, time no longer passed in hours or minutes, but in heavy, dragging moments. Every clink of a lock, every caw of a raven on the tiled roof was a reminder that life now hung by a thread. But Elizabeth did not shatter. She wrote letters, not frantic cries for help, but carefully measured words, each line like a chess move against death itself. She wept when necessary, remained silent when appropriate, and never once allowed a flicker of pride to show. Her sharpness did not lie in pleading her case. It lay in giving no one a reason to touch her neck. And then, strangely enough, she was released. Not because anyone believed her, but because they feared her. Elizabeth, once a prisoner, had become an unsolvable riddle. Too dangerous to kill, too intelligent to dismiss. When the gates of the tower opened and the morning light fell on the red-haired girl's face, it was not simply life being returned, it was a quiet proclamation she had survived. and she would go much farther still. 4 years later, on a misty November morning, church bells rang across London, not to celebrate a saint's feast, but to announce Queen Mary had died. And the girl, who had once been imprisoned for suspicion of treason, now became Queen of England, 25 years old, alone, unmarried, childless, without a loyal army. But she had one thing: preparation. From the moment she left that prison, Elizabeth had been preparing for this hour with every well-timed nod, every precisely spoken word, every step that never missed a beat. As she rode a white horse through the streets of London, the people cheered, tossed their hats, and knelt in the muddy roads. She smiled, not for victory, but because at last she could do the one thing she had always believed in: rule with legitimacy and wisdom. But a nation is not a glittering throne. It is a tattered ship adrift in a storm, the treasury drained, bloody religious divisions and foreign powers circling every weak spot. A queen, slender in frame, yet steely-eyed, had to take the helm. She did not shout. She did not rule like her father, who had slaughtered to secure his authority. Elizabeth governed like a conductor of a symphony, where every decision was a note that had to strike the right tone at the right moment. One of her first actions was to restore the Church of England, but not through blood. There were no book burnings, no random executions. Elizabeth chose a path of balance, not too far toward Protestantism, and not a fiery purge of Catholic heritage. She did not believe in forced faith. She believed in intelligent order. She gathered around her an elite council: William Cecil, the cold political mind; Francis Walsingham, the eyes and ears in the shadows; and Nicholas Bacon, the scale between justice and loyalty. These men understood that they did not serve a woman. They served a symbol that was growing with each passing day. If you were to step out onto your porch and gaze at the sky, imagine a star, not the brightest, not the highest, but steady, unmoving. That is Elizabeth in the year 1558. Not a blazing flame, but a quiet fire strong enough to warm an entire age. Have you ever loved someone you could never have not, because love was absent, but because there were things you simply could not trade away? Years had passed since the day Elizabeth took the throne. She was no longer the 25-year-old girl on a white horse riding through cheers. Now she was a queen presiding over a growing kingdom surrounded by silk statecraft, and a silence only those at the summit can understand. To other nations, a young unmarried queen who possessed both power and beauty was an opportunity not to be missed. Proposals flew in from every direction like letters tangled in invisible flight paths. From Philip II of Spain to Archduke Charles of Austria to Francis, Duke of Anjou. Each man brought not only flowers, but maps, treaties, and ambition. But Elizabeth did not answer. No, yes. No, no. Only silence, strategic and deliberate. She knew well to marry a man meant to share the throne, and to share power for Elizabeth was not love, but political suicide. She was playing a long game. With each delay, each vague promise, Elizabeth was not rejecting a suitor. She was rejecting the notion that anyone else could grip the steering wheel of England's fate. She kept kingdoms suspended enough to avoid offense, but never enough for them to gain ground. Yet, there was one man Elizabeth could not treat as merely a piece on the board: Robert Dudley. They had grown up together. when she was the cast-off princess and he was the young nobleman with laughing eyes. They shared long glances during ceremonies, whispers in quiet corridors, and more than anything a bond that needed no name. Robert understood her. He was one of the rare few who could truly make Elizabeth laugh, truly ease her spirit when everything outside was strategy and performance. But he was also the one who stirred her heart. When his wife died suddenly, the court whispered, "Was this a chance or a trap?" Elizabeth stood between love and the crown and chose the crown. She did not marry him. She married no one at all. Within Whitehall Palace, Elizabeth's court became a grand stage where the air smelled of roses, velvet, and lies. The powerful did not come only to offer tribute, but to perform. Every bow, every glance, every poem was a soft blow in the game of seeking favor. And Elizabeth was the greatest artist of them all. She crafted a persona never before seen in history, the Virgin Queen. Belonging to no man, bound by no private affection. Each portrait was a declaration Elizabeth bathed in white light, wearing a golden crown, robed in pearl-embroidered silk hand, resting upon a globe. She was not merely a queen, she was England itself. And like every veteran actor she knew, there is no role more eternal than the one others must imagine for you. So she kept the deepest parts of herself hidden, untouchable. But behind the gold and grandeur, there was still a human being. Elizabeth lived in a man's world, where every decision was scrutinized not just for policy, but for gender. She had to be strong, but not too cold. She had to say no, but without pride. She had to be brilliant, yet smile with the softness of a woman. Each day she wore armor beneath her gown, not to guard against sword and spear, but to shield her heart from personal wounds. When night fell and the palace glowed only by flickering candlelight, Elizabeth stood alone by the window. The wind outside was no longer an enemy. It was an old friend. And in that silence, perhaps she thought of a hand she could not hold, a smile she could not keep, a child she would never have. But she did not regret, because if Elizabeth knew anything better than anyone, it was this: sometimes to hold a kingdom, you must give up the very things that make you human. And that is the price of a legend. If power is a glittering crown, then the price for it is a solitude unseen by others. During the most dazzling years of Elizabeth I's reign, the English court resembled a grand stage forever lit, where courtiers played their parts in velvet and silk, and she, the only woman who needed no disguise, had become the symbol itself. Whitehall Palace shimmered with candlelight and the scent of lavender. Masks, classical plays, banquets, poetry, and music. Everything bloomed in Elizabeth's hands. But if you could step behind the curtain of this grand performance, you would discover one truth. All that beauty was the most sophisticated makeup of politics. She knew well that every smile was a dagger hidden behind the back, every poem a veiled message, and every whisper a lurking threat. Among courtiers, flatterers, and opportunists, Elizabeth stood firm, not through force, but through an almost chilling understanding of human nature. She had raised men to the peaks of glory and just as easily brought them back down. Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, and then Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Each one stirred the court with the favor she showed them. But Elizabeth was never blind. One step too far, a glance, too proud a decision made without permission, and all could be lost. Elizabeth did not forgive arrogance in her palace, because she knew that in a world where a single wrong nod could change the wearer of the crown's softness was a sin. Yet in that very discipline there lay a sorrow no one dared name the sorrow of someone who would never be fully loved, because no one could love a symbol without fearing its power. As the stage lights reached their brightest, shadows began to gather at the edges of the curtain. Beyond the walls of London, danger was rising, and this time it bore the face of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary was everything Elizabeth was not: a devout Catholic, once Queen of France, soft in manner, with an air of nostalgic beauty. But the most dangerous thing of all, Mary possessed a legitimate royal bloodline, and to many English Catholics she was the true queen. After being deposed in Scotland, Mary fled to England seeking sanctuary. Elizabeth greeted her not with open arms, but with the half-closed door of a gilded prison. For 19 years, Mary lived in guarded castles with golden banquets and walls that offered no escape. Mary did not scream. But the most dangerous person is not the one who cries out, but the one who whispers. And for nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth's court became the epicenter of assassination plots, uprisings, and secret letters written in invisible ink. All threads led to a single name: Mary. Elizabeth knew, but she hesitated, not from ignorance, but because across the chessboard sat another queen like herself, a woman of divine right, a woman who had worn a crown. To kill Mary was to kill a part of the sacred ideal of monarchy that Elizabeth herself embodied, until hesitation was no longer an option. In 1586, the Babington plot was uncovered. A clear conspiracy assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Mary's handwritten letters were seized, the evidence undeniable. Elizabeth stood before the execution warrant, and her hand trembled. She signed, then paused, then signed again. On February 8, 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She wore red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. When the axe touched her neck, it was not only a woman who fell, but the last trace of innocence in Elizabeth's heart that shattered. She withdrew from court for days, told her counselors she had never wished for that death. But she knew, and the world knew, that the death had been sealed. Power is a candle. The brighter it burns, the more it scorches the one who holds it. Elizabeth knew this more than anyone, and in the murky twilight of the 16th century, she stood not only as a queen, but as a woman bearing the eternal conflict between reason and feeling, between survival and righteousness, between the heart and politics. There are victories that leave behind no cheers, only a strange silence after the storm. In 1587, when the axe fell to end the life of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth did not smile. She did not triumph. She simply survived. And sometimes, survival leaves the deepest scar of all. From the moment of that execution, something within her changed, something that had no name. In Elizabeth's eyes, a new shadow appeared, deeper, quieter, no longer cold, but exhausted. She had done what no one else could do, executed a woman of royal blood, a woman who once called her cousin a rival, who was also a distorted mirror of herself. From then on, Elizabeth trusted no one completely. She continued to reign, to stand upon the golden dais, to deliver speeches, to wear a crown that weighed several pounds. But her heart had withdrawn. Gradually, the court grew more orderly, yet colder. The laughter faded. The whispered intrigues became fewer. What remained was ceremony paperwork and a silence that stretched like the very shadow of power. But fate had not yet finished with Elizabeth. A year later, in 1588, the storm did not come from within, but from the sea. Spain, the mightiest Catholic empire in Europe, sent its gift of vengeance for Mary's death, a massive fleet of more than 130 warships, carrying over 30,000 soldiers, marching toward England. They called it the Invincible Armada. Compared to Spain, England was nothing more than a small island with an inexperienced navy. But Elizabeth did not retreat. She did not hide behind stone walls, nor send letters of peace. She rode in person to the military camp at Tilbury, donned silver armor, mounted her horse before thousands of soldiers, and declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England." That was not a speech. It was a vow. No one else but she herself would tie her fate to that of this island nation. Offshore, the sea winds screamed like a prophecy of blood. But the English had what Spain did not. Smaller ships faster and more agile, and sailors ready to give their lives for their coast. When the Armada entered the English Channel, the English did not engage head-on. They swerved, dodged, and burned. Fire ships' vessels, set ablaze and sent crashing into the enemy fleet, broke the Spanish formation. Then nature intervened. Violent storms and crashing waves forced what remained of the Armada northward, spiraling around Scotland in chaos. Nearly half the fleet never returned to Spain. And thus England, a small island, long underestimated, had defeated the most powerful empire in Europe. But this victory was not written only in gunpowder and strategy. It was carved into the very image of Elizabeth. From that moment, she was no longer a queen of flesh and blood. She became a living legend. Paintings showed her with one hand resting on the globe, her gown covered in eyes and ears, symbols that she saw all, heard all. The people called her Gloriana, the shining light of England. Yet no one knew that at night, when the courtiers had withdrawn to their chambers, the queen sat alone in her cold palace, where the candlelight reached only one corner of the high ceiling. She knew every victory had a cost, and the cost this time was time itself, the blood of her soldiers, and a treasury left empty. After the Armada, Elizabeth stood at the very peak of power. Her face was stamped onto coins, medals, tapestries, mirrors, and the memories of millions. But glory could not defy time. One by one, those closest to her faded away. William Cecil, the quiet companion of 40 years, died. Then came the passing of Robert Dudley, the man whom perhaps, just perhaps, she had once loved. Upon hearing of Dudley's death, Elizabeth refused food, refused company, and locked herself away for days. The once radiant palace turned dim. Her portraits seemed to carry a hint of sorrow in eyes that would never age. Time had begun to tap gently upon Elizabeth's shoulder, but she did not retreat. She adjusted her wig, applied more white powder, wore heavier gowns, stood taller. She would not let anyone see her age, for if a legend showed cracks, the entire kingdom might tremble. There are those who walk among us without leaving a sound, only a lingering echo. They do not change the world by shouting, but by holding steadfast to belief through long silences. Elizabeth Fur was one such soul. In the final years of her life, the golden glow of Elizabeth's reign no longer shimmered as it once had. Her closest advisers had passed away. The grand balls, once filled with candlelight and music, had faded into quiet memories behind velvet-draped walls. And the queen who once rode on horseback through cheering crowds now walked slowly through stone corridors, her footsteps echoing like the closing monologue of a role performed for over 4 decades. When the last man she favored, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, rebelled and forced Elizabeth to sign his execution, it was said she neither ate nor slept, not because her power was threatened, but because the last piece of her humanity beneath all the layers of symbolism had shattered once more. Yet even with a broken heart, she stood tall. She let no one see a crack. She let no sign of weakness touch her kingdom. That is how she lived, and how she prepared to depart. In the year 1603, Elizabeth was now 69 years old. Her body had grown frail. Her voice no longer rang as it once did, but her eyes still held a flame. No longer to set the world ablaze, but just enough to keep a light burning in the night. It was said she refused to lie down because she knew when a monarch lies down, a reign is near its end. Instead, she sat for hours on cushions, draped in a pure white gown, as if she had become the ghostly spirit of her own era. Doctors begged her to rest, but she whispered softly, almost to herself, "Must is not a word to be used to princes." In her final moment, when asked who would succeed, her Elizabeth is believed to have pointed north toward James VI of Scotland, the son of the very woman she had once ordered executed. A choice that closed the circle of history not with vengeance, but with acceptance of fate. On March 24th, 1603, as Elizabeth's final breath faded into the air at Richmond, England did not simply lose a monarch, it lost an era. All of London fell into mourning black. Church bells rang as if the heavens themselves bowed in farewell. But no one truly witnessed Elizabeth die. For the moment, she closed her eyes. She became something greater than life, a legend. Elizabeth left no children, no marriage, no family in the ordinary sense. But she left behind an England that was confident, independent, and free to define itself. She left behind a mirror for all who had ever been dismissed, imprisoned, or stripped of a name to show that you can still rise and shape history simply by existing. She was born in scandal, raised in fear, reigned in doubt, but departed as a sacred chapter in the epic of humanity. And you know what? That story, though centuries behind us, is closer than we think. Because in every woman who stands for what is right, in every young soul underestimated but unshaken, in everyone who chooses solitude over compromise, there is a trace of Elizabeth. The girl once locked in a stone tower, the woman who never wore a wedding gown, the monarch who shared no throne, became a symbol not because she was perfect, but because she had the courage to live true to her path to her very last breath. And if tonight, as you turn off the light, lie down to rest, and hear a distant bell echoing, remember that someone once lived like an unwritten poem, a poem about freedom, choice, and dignity. History does not always belong to the powerful. Sometimes it belongs to those who never bow. And if you dream tonight, dream as Elizabeth lived quietly, fiercely, without ever asking for permission to be glorious. Have you ever heard a language of silence? Not a dead language, not a faded manuscript, but a tongue that once ruled the world, once used to speak to the gods, to praise the kings, to carve prayers into stone, and then vanished as if it had never existed. No one knew where it went or how to summon it back. And for over a millennium, Egypt, a civilization that once blazed bright in the desert, remained a picture without a voice. Imagine standing inside an ancient temple in Karnak. Towering above are massive stone columns carved from top to bottom with strange symbols, the eye of Horus, falcons, reeds, scarabs. Each engraving is as sharp as if made just yesterday, yet not a soul, no scholar, no priest can understand what they mean. So what happened? How did such a mighty script fall into silence? Long ago, Egyptian hieroglyphs were among the most vibrant languages on earth. They were everywhere on temple walls, in tombs, on papyrus scrolls and coffins. Priests composed hymns in this script. Scribes recorded laws, harvests, and everyday life with it. It was not just how Egyptians wrote it, it was how they made sense of the world, how they connected to the gods, how they immortalized memory. But then, as is often the case with things that seem eternal, time began to erode it. Egypt was no longer Egypt's alone. Waves of invaders came in succession. The Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. Each culture brought a new language, a new system of writing. Gradually, hieroglyphs, which had long been the domain of priests, ceased to be learned, ceased to be taught. And one day, the last person who could read them passed away. The final known hieroglyph was carved in the year 394 Common Era. Then, silence. As if Egypt had spoken its last word, then vanished into shadow. By the 18th century, Europeans began to rediscover Egypt in their own way. They flocked to the Nile like sleepwalkers, sketching monuments, bringing mummies back, as curiosities, building museums to display statues of pharaohs they could not understand. The ancient symbols became little more than exotic decorations, people called them, mystical, magical, symbolic. No one believed any more that it had once been a living language, pronounceable, intelligible, translatable. Scholars argued. Some claimed it was a pictorial language meant only to be felt, not read. Others insisted it was an ancient code knowable only to those whose souls had been enlightened. But the more they tried, the more lost they became, trapped in a maze with no entry point, no key, no way out. Then, one sweltering summer day in 1799, fate cracked open the door. At an old fort near the town of Rosetta, a quiet place along the Nile Delta, a group of French soldiers were digging foundations for a military project. One of them struck an odd black stone. It was not shaped like a statue or treasure, but across its surface were 3 distinct lines of script, carved deep and clear, one in Greek, one in Demotic, and one in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The commanding officer, a man named Pierre-François Bouchard, immediately sensed something unusual. He ordered the stone to be cleaned. And when sunlight struck those ancient carvings, it felt as though history itself held its breath. The Greek script was readable to French scholars. If the 3 inscriptions told the same story, then perhaps after thousands of years, we now held in our hands a translation, a bridge between knowledge and forgetting, a way to call ancient Egypt back from the dark. That was the moment the journey began, a journey not of swords and conquest, but of intellect. A race not for generals, but for those who toiled over ink and parchment. They called it the Rosetta Stone, And it was not gold nor jeweled artifact, but this that proved the true treasure. For it gave humanity a gift more precious than all the riches of the earth, the chance to hear the past speak once more. As the Egyptian sun poured fire down on the palm-lined streets of the town of Rosetta, the French soldiers kept their heads bowed beneath the searing heat. They were not archaeologists. They were ordinary men, shovels in hand, rebuilding the crumbling fortress of Fort Julien under the orders of a commander hundreds of miles away, Napoleon Bonaparte. And then there was a clink, not the sound of breaking gravel, but of metal striking something hard, solid, and strangely out of place. One soldier stopped. Beneath layers of fine dust and tangled roots, a black stone lay motionless, as if it had been waiting over 1,000 years just to be found in that precise moment. Pierre-François Bouchard, the engineering officer in charge of the area, was summoned. He knelt, brushing aside the thin soil. Before him were 3 lines carved deep into the stone's surface. The top row held mysterious signs, twisting forms, the eye of Horus falcons. The middle line flowed more smoothly, curling like cursive script. And finally, the bottom line, classical Greek, sharp and familiar. He could not read the first 2 lines, but the last, he recognized it immediately. It was a royal decree written in Greek. None of them knew exactly what they were looking at, but there was a feeling they could not name, as if time itself had just shuddered. The air seemed to slow. History whispered. It was July of 1799. Napoleon Bonaparte was waging campaigns across Egypt, but he had not brought only cannons. He had brought over 150 scholars, artists, engineers, naturalists, linguists. He believed that Egypt was not merely a battlefield, but a key to reopen the door to humanity's past. When the Rosetta Stone was brought to Cairo, French scholars gathered around it like children witnessing magic for the first time. They knew if all 3 lines held the same content, then this was the bridge between the ancient and the modern world. A Google Translate carved in stone from 2,000 years ago. But at that very moment, a new race began. Not on the battlefield, but in quiet rooms filled with maps, candlelight, and plaster copies. To the scholar's eye, the Rosetta Stone was no longer just a slab. It was a challenge, a riddle, a beacon of hope. Gradually, they discovered that the text was a royal decree from the year 196. Before the Common Era, under the reign of Ptolemy V, a young king in an Egypt deeply Hellenized. The content was not particularly mystical. It praised the king for his generosity toward temples and ordered his statues to be erected throughout the land. But what made it extraordinary was not the message, it was how it was written in 3 scripts representing 3 layers of society. Hieroglyphs for the priests, Demotic for the scribes, and Greek the language of the ruling elite. The ancient world had left behind a perfect fragment, 3 versions of the same message inscribed on a single stone. But the problem was, no one could read 2 out of the 3. When the war between France and the British Ottoman coalition ended in 1801, the Rosetta Stone was not treated as humanity's heritage. It was a spoil of war. Under the surrender terms signed in Alexandria, the British demanded everything map specimens and the stone itself. The French scholars protested bitterly, some even wept. But the tears of knowledge could not stop the march of empire. The stone was crated sealed and placed aboard a British-flagged ship. On its journey to London, no one knew that within the past was breathing quietly and patiently. When it arrived at the British Museum in 1802, the Rosetta Stone was not set in a golden frame. It rested under soft light, surrounded by plaster casts and sleep-deprived scholars. A new inscription was carved onto the stone in English, captured in Egypt by the British Army 1801. A declaration that needed no further explanation. It is ours now. And so, from a chance discovery, a silent war of language was born. France did not forget. Copies of the stone had been painstakingly traced by the savants before they were forced to leave. In Paris, scholars set to work driven by the feverish urgency of reviving a dying soul. Meanwhile, in England, linguists and decoders of ancient scripts refused to yield. They saw it not just as an old document, but as an invitation from history itself. Listen to me. In the silence of libraries among yellowed pages and trembling hands, a sound began to rise, faint but powerful. It was not a voice. It was the sound of understanding returning. And somewhere not far in the future, someone would lean close to that stone and finally hear Egypt whisper after over 1,000 years of silence. Can you imagine it? A slab of rough black stone, cracked and weathered, lying there behind thick glass at the British Museum, surrounded by footsteps and clicking cameras. But over 2 centuries ago, when it first arrived in London, no one came to admire it. People came to understand, to decipher, to make it speak the secrets it had held for 1,400 years. After being taken from Egypt by the British Army in 1801, the Rosetta Stone became a prize in a war no longer waged with swords, but with intellect. The French had found it copied. It caught the first glimpse of hope. But the British held it. And in an age of ambitious empires, even a dead language could be claimed as property. In Paris, French scholars became like souls left behind. With no stone in hand, they had only their transcriptions. But what they possessed was persistence. To them, the Rosetta Stone was not an object, it was a challenge. An ancient whisper. If you are patient enough, I will tell you the story of a civilization that has long slept. In the early 19th century, all of Europe trembled. Not from war this time, but from an academic dream to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. That dream was no simple feat, for the symbols were not letters in the usual sense. They were images, an eye, a lion, a rope, a lotus blossom. Were they symbols? Sounds, prayers? No one knew. Some scholars believed hieroglyphs were the language of the gods, inaccessible to mortal understanding. Others thought it was a code solvable only through philosophy and intuition. A few tried to match each hieroglyph to a Greek letter like building a watch without its springs. But every effort sank into the sand. It remained a labyrinth, beautiful, but without an exit. And then, a small sign appeared. In 1802 in Sweden, a little-known diplomat named Johann David Åkerblad turned his attention to the demotic script on the stone. The middle inscription simpler than hieroglyphs, yet already faded from human memory. He had no fame, no school of thought behind him, only care and patience. He compared each demotic symbol to the Greek tracing familiar names. And he achieved something no one expected. He identified personal names such as Ptolemy and Alexander. For the first time, someone had fit a piece of the past into the puzzle of the present. It was small, but it was a first ray of light inside a dark cave. Yet, the greater work had not yet begun. One thing was still missing, a mind sharp enough to see the structure behind the mystique of hieroglyphs, a heart patient enough to sit in silence before the cartouches, the circles surrounding royal names, and most of all, a belief that this ancient language could once again be heard in the voice of a human being. That person had not yet emerged, but fate had already chosen him. He was growing up quietly in a small French town. In a quiet corner of Figeac, a town barely marked on the map, there was a boy who often sat alone reading under the glow of an oil lamp. Jean-François Champollion. From an early age, he avoided ordinary childhood games. He read Latin by the age of 10. He could read Coptic by 12. Language was his friend, his refuge, his secret world. Champollion did not study just to understand. He studied to listen. He believed that Coptic, the language of Egypt's earliest Christians, was the final living remnant of ancient Egyptian. And if that were true, then Coptic was the key, and hieroglyphs were the door. He told his brother a sentence that frightened their whole family. "I will decipher the hieroglyphs or die trying." As Champollion grew, life led him to Paris, where he gained access to copies of the Rosetta Stone. There was no spotlight, only paper ink and long nights. He followed the cartouches matching symbols to names. Ptolemy, Cleopatra. And slowly, letters began to emerge. They were no longer mere images. They were sounds. He dared to do what no one else had, to treat hieroglyphs as an alphabet with sounds, structure, and rhythm. And when the pieces finally fell into place, history erupted. September 1822. Champollion burst into his brother's office, translation in hand, panting, and shouted the now famous words, "Je tiens l'affaire, I have it." And then he collapsed from emotion. In that moment, ancient Egypt ceased to be silent. And for the first time in 14 centuries, a civilization rose, stepped out of the shadows, and whispered once again in its own voice. Imagine a small room in the heart of Paris in the autumn of 1822. The chill has arrived, carried in by the changing season, with mist clinging softly to the window panes. In that room, a young man with disheveled hair and deep-set eyes leans over his desk, holding a quill in his trembling hand, as if he were writing not with ink, but with the soul of an entire civilization. That man was Jean-François Champollion, and on that night he changed history. But to reach that moment, Champollion had to conquer more than just the mysteries of language. He had to face a society rife with doubt and prejudice. At that time, Europe was not eager to believe that a young man from the provinces could accomplish what the most celebrated scholars had failed to do for centuries. A boy who once declared he would wake Egypt from its slumber. What could he be if not arrogant? And hieroglyphs, that script dismissed even by the mighty Greeks and Romans. Could it truly be a language that one could hear? They laughed. They dismissed him. They whispered behind his back, saying that Champollion was too dreamy, too French, in a world that was turning increasingly toward dry empiricism. But what they failed to understand was this: Champollion did not merely read hieroglyphs. He heard them, like a musician hearing melody within discord, like a poet grasping meaning in silence. He began with the cartouches, the oval rings that enclosed the names of kings. With the help of Rosetta Stone copies and other ancient texts, Champollion compared, examined, measured. And slowly, from those seemingly nonsensical symbols, the lion, the owl, the coiled rope, he began to see patterns. Some of them represented sounds, not just images. Centuries of theory unraveled. Hieroglyphs were not merely symbolic. They formed a hybrid system, phonetic, ideographic, and symbolic all at once. An owl was not merely a bird of the night. It was the sound M. A reed was not just a plant. It stood for the letter I. And if you read long enough, deep enough, the language came alive. Sentences emerged. Prayers. Simple things and profound. That night, when Champollion cried out, "Je tiens l'affaire," I have it, and collapsed into his brother's arms, it was more than an academic triumph. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. From that moment on, Egypt was no longer a silent picture. It began to speak. Hundreds of scholars across Europe rushed to ancient texts, monuments, temples. They carried with them Champollion's alphabet, as missionaries once carried scripture. On the walls of Luxor, in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, in tightly wrapped scrolls hidden for thousands of years, everything began to tell stories. Not just royal decrees, but love poems between farmers, a land lease agreement, a prayer from a grieving mother, a joke carved into the wall of a public bath, and quiet invocations to the dead written on tomb walls. Ancient Egypt was no longer the realm of distant gods. It became us, our sorrow, our faith, our longing. But Champollion did not stop at his desk. In 1828, he set foot on the very land that had planted the seed of his passion, Egypt. There he stood among the columns of Karnak. He looked up at the walls inscribed with hieroglyphs no longer foreign to him, and he read them aloud in his own voice, as if calling the pharaohs home. The Egyptians around him watched in awe. For the first time, a European had come not just to look, but to listen. And they listened too. Tragically, just 3 years later, Champollion died. He was only 41, far too young. But his life had not been in vain. He had not only deciphered a language, he had decoded the humanity behind those ancient symbols. He had brought to life what had been entombed in stone for 14 centuries. Tonight, if by chance you pass by the British Museum where the Rosetta Stone still rests behind glass, stop for a moment. Do not whisper, just listen. Because if you are patient enough, you may hear the voices of pyramid builders, of a mother from Thebes, of a prince named Akhenaten writing to his beloved. All of them are whispering. Because long ago, one man chose to listen, and that voice, it has never stopped. When Jean-François Champollion died in 1832, it was said he left this world with a smile on his lips. Perhaps because he knew that what he had done did not end with him. It was only the beginning. After the groundbreaking discovery of 1822, Champollion's legacy began to spread. Not like thunder, but like a quiet rain falling over dust-covered temples, silent, patient, but soaking deep into the stone. Across Europe, scholars stepped into the world of hieroglyphs, like people handed a key to a room sealed for 1,000 years. They carried Champollion's alphabet to Thebes, to Luxor, to Abu Simbel, to walls once dismissed as art, but now something more. Now those walls could speak. A young man in England bent over the Rosetta Stone at the British Museum, his notes crowding the margins of every scrap of paper. In Germany, a professor turned pages of papyrus by the light of an oil lamp, as if following a whisper from a past life. In France, archaeological teams packed their gear for Egypt, bringing along the unfinished Grammaire Égyptienne, Champollion's Egyptian grammar, as their guiding scripture. And slowly, a sealed world began to open. The Book of the Dead, once dismissed as an odd illustrated scroll filled with bird-headed gods, suddenly had a voice. No longer just imagery, but language. Every spell was a guide for the soul through the realm of darkness. You shall pass through the gate of judgment. You shall not lie. You shall not kill you. Shall not betray the bread of your friend. This was not the morality of gods, but of humans. And so ancient mummies, once mere museum relics, became witnesses of very human fears, beliefs, and dreams. The most astonishing revelations were not just the names of mighty emperors like Ramses or Thutmose. They were the fragments of humble lives. A love note etched into the wall of a tomb. Though you are gone, my heart still belongs to you. A slab carved with a mocking poem about a strict construction supervisor. A lease agreement for a pair of oxen to plow the fields. Ancient Egypt was no longer a world of distant myths. It became a world of people. People who loved, who grieved, who remembered, who laughed, and who died. Hieroglyphs were not merely writing. They were art. An owl was not only the letter M, but a symbol of wisdom. A crescent shape was not just the sound K, but also a blade, a symbol of life and death. Each sign carried not one meaning, but layers of meanings stacked like echoes across time. This was not a language to be scribbled in haste. It was a dance between image, sound, and emotion. And so when we read ancient texts today, we do not just know what they said, we feel what they longed for. To scholars, decoding the script was not merely an academic conquest. It was the rebuilding of a soul. And to Egypt, once seen as a silent monument, it was a resurrection. The academic world in Europe caught fire. Universities opened courses in Egyptology. Museums began hiring interpreters to read ancient texts aloud for the public. Exhibitions no longer simply displayed objects, they told the story of each statue, each scroll of papyrus, each brick etched with meaning. But not everyone saw it as an unblemished miracle. In Cairo, local Egyptians watched as their ancient inscriptions were taken away, their stones uprooted from the desert and placed behind European glass cases, and they began to ask, why does our land now speak in someone else's tongue? Public debates arose. Should the Rosetta Stone, now lying in London, return to its Egyptian homeland? Yes, it is a symbol of human knowledge. But it is also a relic removed during an age of colonial domination. A larger question emerged. Does understanding the past mean owning it? The world has not answered that question. But one thing is certain. The language that was once lost has come back to life. Not in the mouths of priests, but in books, in classrooms, in museums, and in the imagination of a new generation. Every child who looks at an Egyptian statue and asks, "What does this say?" is proof that the voice of the Nile has never truly gone silent. And in the heart of the night, if you press your ear against a wall of stone, whether in Egypt or in some distant museum, you may still hear the whispers, not of the dead, but of a language awakened. The night has grown late. If you are lying in a quiet room somewhere, soft yellow light glowing beside you and beyond the window, the slow breath of the city perhaps, you will hear something. Not the sound of cars, not the wind, but a faint echo like a whisper drifting in from a faraway place, a place called Egypt. Not the Egypt of tourists and postcard pyramids, but the Egypt of people who once lived, who once loved, who once carved their words into stone, believing that if they etched them deeply enough, their voices would live forever. And they were right. Do you remember? It all began with an unremarkable slab of stone unearthed by weary soldiers, hands dusty from labor. None of them knew they had just uncovered a fragment of a key not to treasure, but to human memory. From that moment, generations of scholars, linguists, and dreamers followed in quiet succession. They did not shout. They wore no medals, claimed no glorious victories. But they, those who sat patiently by candlelight, deciphering each owl, each reed, each eye carved in stone, made it possible for a civilization to hear its own voice again. Hieroglyphs were no longer strange drawings, but songs, love poems, prayers, land leases, and even jokes scratched along the walls of ancient bathhouses. Each symbol, each stroke began to vibrate like the strings of an instrument touched by a careful hand, and the music of memory began to play. But tonight, I do not just want to tell you about the past. I want you to feel something. That sometimes the most beautiful things do not come from conquest or power, but from listening. From the quiet patience of hearing what was once thought lost. We people of the 21st century, always rushing, always connected, might just have something to learn from silent stones. Imagine if the man digging the fort had not stumbled on the slab, if Bouchard had not paused to wipe off the dust, if the scholars, French, Swedish, English, if that boy named Champollion had never once whispered, "I will wake Egypt or die trying," then perhaps today we would still look at hieroglyphs and see only mystery. Everything we know now comes from a long line of people who did not give up. And now the Rosetta Stone still lies behind thick glass at the British Museum. Each day thousands walk past it. Some pause. Others glance and move on. Few realize that this cracked piece of stone had once been forgotten for over a millennium, that it once lay buried in the sand carrying a message no one had yet read, and that there were those who gave their lives to make it speak again. It is not a crown, not gold, not a treasure, just an old decree written in 3 languages on a broken stone. But it did what no law or battle ever could. It bridged 2 worlds. And if you live in America today, a land of 1,000,000 voices and hundreds of heritages, the story of the Rosetta Stone may not feel so distant. Because sometimes what divides us is not belief or color, but silence left unspoken. How many people around us live like unread stones? How many memories, experiences, and cultures remain locked inside someone waiting for a gaze? Patient enough and ear quiet enough to hear. The Rosetta Stone gave us much. But its greatest lesson is not how to read hieroglyphs. It is this: no civilization ever truly disappears as long as someone is willing to hear its voice. And deeper still, within every person, within you and me, there is a part buried deep, a part waiting to be awakened, not by shouting, but by understanding, love, and persistence. So tonight, before you turn off the light, think about this. Is there something in you that has been forgotten? A memory in your family yet to be told? Someone near you who is whispering, and you just have not been still enough to listen? Be the one who carries the key. You might just help someone or yourself return to their true voice. And when that happens, you will understand. Stones are never just stones. They are the promises of time. Good night. Have you ever heard of a Spartan woman? Not for her triumphs in battle, not for her husband or children, but for the nights of the full moon, when she would quietly leave the city, searching for something even the gods dared not name. No history book remembers her name. No monument was ever raised in her honor, and no written account survived the ravages of conquest and time. But on a windless night, if you listen closely between the rustling of olive leaves and the drip of water over rock, you might hear the soft steps of bare feet brushing past the grass. And eyes that once made an entire army lower, their gaze are watching the moon as if it were the only escape from a world of swords and blood. Nearly 3,000 years ago in Sparta, a place where boys were taught to kill before they were taught to speak, where honor was not written in words but carved into bone, a child was born during a solar eclipse. The sky was not merely dark, it was red. Clouds like torn strips of blood streaked the heavens. People called it a bad omen. But the elders, wiser and quieter, whispered something different. This is no child of mortals. They named her Leonthe, Little Lioness, daughter of Commander Adrastos, a man who believed only in victory and glorious death. She grew up among the clash of sword and shield in lessons of discipline, order, and the cost of weakness. But even as a child, there was something in her that made people avoid her gaze. Not because she was fierce, but because her eyes were too still. Like the surface of a deep lake without a ripple, yet certainly hiding something unnamed beneath. At just 12, she had thrown all 3 of her older brothers in wrestling. By 16, she led a band of hunters up Mount Titus, a wilderness so feared even Spartan soldiers avoided it, and returned with 3 wild boars tied to her chariot. The citizens of Sparta did not know whether to call her a hero or a curse, so they chose both. She was respected and feared. But no one knew that behind that cold steel armor, behind the steps that never hurried, was a heart that did not long for victory. Each night when the campfires burned low and the sounds of training faded, Leonthe would remove her armor, revealing scars like spider webs crawling across the back that had once carried a whole battalion. She would gaze at the sky not to question the gods, but to silently hear something echoing inside herself. Like a call, like a melody from a place far away, a tune no one had taught her to hear, yet she had always known it was there. And then, on the first full moon of early summer, she walked out of the city gates unnoticed. She left behind her spear and short sword, left behind her name and station, and followed a narrow path that led up Eurytus Hill. No one went there without a reason. But Leonthe had none, except for a feeling, a pull in her blood, like a wordless song. At the hill's summit, the forest appeared like a forbidden thing. Ancient oaks closed in above her, forming a silver canopy under the moonlight. The wind barely stirred, and a lake nestled between 2 steep cliffs lay still, so perfectly still it seemed not like water, but like glass. And in the center of that lake, it was there, a swan, motionless, unafraid. The moonlight fell across its back, reflecting a faint silver shimmer like shattered stars. It looked at her not with the gaze of a beast, not with instinct, but as if it had been waiting, as if it had waited a long time. Leonthe froze at the water's edge. Every warrior instinct within her, every doubt and guard, tightened like a drawn bowstring. But there was no danger, only stillness and something close to sacred. She took a step. The swan tilted its head. Another step. The lake remained unmoved. She knelt without knowing why, as if her knees knew on their own that they must bend. And when her fingers touched that impossibly soft plumage, warm like the early winter sun, not hot just enough to make her heart clench, she felt something she had never known in all her years as a warrior. The swan did not fly. It simply turned and glided away deeper into the lake. And Leonthe remained there as though she had just stepped out of a dream she did not yet understand. But she knew one thing: she would return, and what waited in the moonlight was not an animal, not a vision. It was the beginning of a story that would shatter every rule of Sparta, every oath of the warrior, and even the silence of the gods. That night a gentle wind blew from the Laconian sea, carrying the scent of salt and pine resin. Leonthe walked slowly along the familiar paths, her feet knowing them like the edge of a blade. But this time she wore no armor, carried no sword. Only a light cloak draped over her shoulders and a ripe fig branch in her hand. Once they had taught her that warriors did not need softness. But now she did not come to conquer. She came simply to be. The forest welcomed her again with that profound silence, as if even the earth itself was holding its breath. The lake was still there, just as still as before, and so was the swan. It glided out from beneath the trees, its wings tucked close to its body, like a story folded shut. No greeting, no flutter of feathers. But Leonthe knew it had been waiting. She sat down this time closer to the water's edge, her palm resting lightly on the cool stone. The swan approached like a drifting cloud. She did not reach out. She simply waited. And it came to her, its neck tilted as if reading her mood, or perhaps listening for a melody only those who have known loss can hear. Weeks passed, then months, and still she returned. Each full moon, each visit like a brief stanza of a poem, never written, never spoken, only lived. Gradually she began to bring small gifts: a strip of hand-woven cloth, a carved wooden pin, a tiny porcelain jar of scented oil. Not offerings, just a way of saying, "I see you." The swan never took them, but it never left. It remained beside her like a light that never dazzled, but was enough to keep her from feeling lost. Sometimes it stood near her for hours without moving, simply being. And that was enough for her to begin to speak. No more commands, no more strategy. Leonthe spoke of her father, the general, who had never praised his daughter, who only knew how to count victories. She spoke of the first time she killed a man, and the cold that settled in her chest, lingering for years. She spoke of sleepless nights when other girls dreamed of weddings, and she dreamed of sitting alone without judgment. The swan never answered, but in its silence she felt something she had never been given before: true attention, not out of duty, not out of desire, just a presence that listened. But Sparta never slept for long, and the world does not easily tolerate a powerful woman who disappears every full moon. First came the whispers. She is not as she once was. Her strikes lack cruelty. She smiled. But to whom? Then came suspicion. A patrol was ordered to follow her. They lost her trail as she slipped into the olive woods, but the rumors spread. The priests began to speak of omens. Some whispered that the lake where Leonthi vanished each month was a place where gods once wept. They were afraid, not because they knew what was happening, but because they could not control it. Her father, General Adrastos, sensed it before the others. He summoned her, pretending it was to discuss strategy for the Messenian campaign. But once the door closed, he spoke plainly. "Where are you going, Leonthi?" She did not answer. "You think you are so different. You can do whatever you please." She looked at her father, not with defiance, but with a gaze as calm as the mountain stones that had withstood 100 seasons of war. "I have done nothing wrong," she said simply. "That is what frightens me the most," he replied, his voice deep as rumbling stone. That night Leonthi left the city once more. But this time, her heart was heavy. At the lake, the Swan was already waiting. She brought nothing but herself. No gifts, no words. Only a soul questioning its own path. "Do you understand what I am giving up?" she asked softly. The Swan tilted its head, gently, neither confirming nor denying. She sat down closer to it than ever before. She leaned her head against its neck, and in that moment she realized something she had never allowed herself to accept in all her years as a warrior: to love something one can never possess, and to choose to love it still, even knowing the cost. And so the second part of Leonthi's journey came to a close, not with blood, not with victory, but with the quietest and most courageous choice of all: to set down her armor and guard her heart instead. Because not every battle is fought on the battlefield. Some are waged in silence between what we are taught and what we dare to believe is right. Leonthi had once believed she understood silence. She was raised among the cold stone corridors of Sparta, where praise was rarer than scars, where tenderness was never permitted to be spoken aloud. But now she understood silence was not merely the absence of sound. It could be a refuge, or an abyss, and the Swan, the voiceless god, was that abyss. 3 full moons had passed. 3 times Leonthi had left her encampment, abandoned glory and laws to walk into the forest where time stood still. Each time she stayed longer, went deeper, not only into the shadows of the trees, but into something unnamed within herself. A place that was soft, vulnerable, yet alive. But this time, the air was different. The wind blew from the north, carrying the chill of the Taygetus Mountains. The sky was dappled with clouds, and the moonlight flickered, as if uncertain whether it wished to witness what was about to unfold. Leonthi walked slowly, not from fatigue, but because her heart beat out of rhythm. Something was unsettled. The Swan, usually waiting at the water's edge, poised and calm, like a marble sculpture, was not there. She searched along the shoreline, calling not with voice, but with presence. And then it emerged from the mist hovering above the lake, moving without sound, yet no longer with its usual grace. Its feathers stirred like a flame disturbed by wind, and its gaze was anxious. Leonthe sat down as always, but this time did not extend her hand. She looked into those eyes, eyes that had once brought her peace, and for the first time she saw it something hidden. That night she dreamed. In the dream she was no longer a warrior. She stood in a silver forest, her hands dusted in golden ash. Before her was a statue, half man, half bird, kneeling within a ring of light. Its hair was made of fire, its skin warm marble, and its eyes were not divine, but of a soul forgotten far too long. She called a name she had never learned, yet her tongue knew it, her heart knew it. Apollo. The statue cracked. From the fissures a voice rose not into her ears, but through her bones. Truth shall freeze what love has kindled. Leonthe awoke with a start, cold sweat clinging to her like spring water. She wanted to dismiss it. Just a dream. But seasoned warriors do not believe in coincidence. They believe in instinct. And her instinct screamed, the prophecy had begun. The next morning she left the city before the sun could reach the peak of the Athena statue. No one stopped her. But eyes followed officers, priests, even comrades who had once laughed with her on the training field. They sensed the change without understanding it. Only Adrastos, her father, stood on the stone steps and said nothing, because he understood, and he knew she had gone too far to return. This time Leonthe did not take the familiar path. She let her feet guide her. Through tangled trails never walked before past wild myrtle and the bitter scent of resin. She moved like a dreamer until a moss-covered canopy revealed the entrance to an ancient grove, a place where time had slept since the Titans still walked the earth. There she saw an altar, weathered, cracked, but unmistakable, and upon it, amid the faded gold lichen, were letters carved in dimmed gold Apollon. Her breath caught not from fear, but because every fragment had fallen into place. The unearthly warmth of the Swan, the way it listened, the dreams, the moons, and the ancient name her soul had spoken the night before. It was not a creature bewitched. It was a god. And somehow she had broken the curse that protected them both. A soft beat of wings behind her. The swan had followed, but its usual shimmering light was gone. Its feathers were dull. Its eyes in pain. Leonthe turned. They looked at each other with nothing left to hide. "I know," she whispered, as if confessing a sin no one had ever taught her to regret. The wind stopped. A single white feather fell from the swan's back, touched the altar stone, and turned to dust. And there, in the heart of the ancient forest, between a woman and a swan, the truth was finally called by its name. From that moment, there was no turning back, for the name of the god had been spoken, and the curse had awakened. There are moments when silence becomes so dense, you can hear your heart tighten. And that night, Leonthe stepped into such a moment, not a silence of peace, but of fate, holding its final breath before it shatters. After the night of dreams and ancient whispers, Leonthe was no longer the woman who left Sparta merely to seek quiet. She now carried the truth, and that truth weighed upon her like a sword, still sheathed but heavy with consequence. Sparta remained unchanged. Towering stone walls, training yards echoing with clashing steel, and the watchful eyes of those who feared what they could not understand. But she no longer belonged to that world. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She did not smile. As the sun sank behind the Taygetus mountains, and the full moon rose like the clouded eye of a god who no longer intervened, Leonthe donned her cloak and left camp earlier than usual. But this time it was not just intuition that drove her. It was dread, as if every step she took was to reach something that was on the verge of disappearing. By the time she reached the moonlit forest, the air had changed. The scent of charred wood and mist so thick it clung like ink. The branches that once arched like temple domes now curled inward as if trying to hide what was coming. The lake no longer mirrored the sky, but lay like a veil drawn over something that was dying. And the Swan was there. But it no longer held the beauty of a dream. The feathers that once shimmered with silver now dulled like cooled ash. It did not glide out to greet her as before. It stood still, unmoving like a statue, its eyes no longer luminous, but sunken into the place where darkness begins. Leonthe stood frozen, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. There was a fear in her, not of death, not of divinity, but of watching everything she loved unravel before her eyes, knowing she was the one who set it in motion. 3 nights ago, she had spoken his name, Apollo, the god who had once moved poets to light candles and made soldiers kneel. She had not meant to. The name came to her like breath, like something undeniable. But she knew the moment it was spoken, the curse had awakened. She did not know what the punishment would be. But now, seeing the swan trembling its feathers, falling like winter leaves, she understood the price of love was him. Leonthe stepped forward, each step a choice, a silent apology, a prayer that had no words. I did not know, her voice barely more than mist. If I could go back, I would. The swan did not answer, but in its mute gaze there was something forgiving, and something that said goodbye. And then the wind stopped. A single feather fell and touched the ground. There was no sound, but none was needed, for from within that body light began to split and bloom. Not with thunder, not violently, but like a sacred melody returning to its original form. The swan's neck arched, its wings spread. Feathers turned to strands of gold light radiating like roots beneath the heavens. The parts that had been bird now cracked open into something human. And before Leonthe Apollo emerged, kneeling, bare, fragile and radiant like a sunrise condemned to walk the earth. His skin glowed faintly like fired clay. His hair shimmered like severed strands of sunset. But his eyes were unforgettable. The eyes of a god who had known love and was about to lose himself. Leonthe dropped to her knees beside him. She wanted to speak, something that might undo what had begun. But no words came, only her hand. She reached for his, felt the warmth still lingering. I did not mean to, she whispered. Apollo smiled. Not in forgiveness, but in understanding. I know. And the ground began to tremble. Not an earthquake, but the judgment of fate, gentle yet absolute. Bit by bit the light withdrew from him. His skin turned to stone. His body hardened, frozen in that final moment, a god reaching for a love he would never touch again. Leonthi wept, but did not scream. She was a warrior, and this was the first loss she could not reclaim. As the last of the moon slipped behind a veil of cloud, Apollo was no longer man. He was statue. A stone figure kneeling at the lakeside, gaze fixed upon the place where Leonthi still trembled in the grass. She wrapped her arms around that petrified hand, as though cradling the last memory of something that was never allowed to exist. No one came to save. No thunder struck. No Zeus appeared. Only the wind began to blow in reverse, and the night sank into the heavy silence of a love condemned. And so the truth took form. But in return, love was no more. There are loves that do not blaze like fire, but burn quietly, until they become stone. And even then, they continue to live beneath the still surface like a heartbeat the world no longer hears. That morning, Sparta did not notice the absence of a warrior. No one knocked on Leonthi's door. No one asked where she was. In a city where loyalty was measured by obedience, those who stayed silent were simply assumed to still obey. But in truth, she was kneeling in a nameless forest beside a statue newly born from sorrow. Apollo, the one who was once the light of the world, was now marble. Kneeling, his form suspended between man and God, wings half unfurled behind him, as if reaching for something that had already slipped away. His face bore no anger, no plea. Only one thing remained in his expression, the ache of a goodbye, never spoken. Leonthi sat beside him. She did not speak. She did not sob aloud. Her tears traced silent paths down her cheeks, soaked into her collar, and fell upon the earth where he had once knelt, once looked at her, once smiled and said 3 final words: "I know." Her hand brushed against his now stone, but still holding a faint warmth, like the last heat of a star long dead. She gripped it tightly, though she knew stone could not feel pain. But perhaps a god could. Around them, the forest held its breath. Trees bowed slightly. The wind ceased. The lake, once a mirror of the heavens, now lay under a veil of ash, flat, cold, and absolutely unwilling to reflect what had been lost. No one came. No one witnessed. And that made it all the more real. Leonthi did not return to Sparta. Not because she feared it, but because she no longer belonged to it. She removed her armor and left it at the old altar where his name carved in faded gold had led her to the edge of tragedy. She placed her sword, the one forged for her by her father, down by the lake's edge, and then she knelt once more beside him, resting her head against his marble shoulder, as if in enough stillness, enough patience, he might return. But stone does not speak, and gods had gone silent. Time passed like mist slipping from oak leaves. Villagers nearby began to whisper of a woman who appeared beneath the moonlight, tall and slender hair, loose eyes distant as though listening to a melody no one remembered. They called her a ghost, a mad woman, a chosen one. But no one approached, and she did not need them to. Each month, under the full moon, Leonthi returned to the same place. No offerings, no prayers, just presence. She sat beside him for hours, sometimes speaking of trivial things of the coming autumn of war stirring beyond the hills of dreams that returned night after night. On other nights, she sang, softly, like a lullaby whispered into the mist not meant for human ears. And often she said nothing, her hand resting on the stone one, sometimes smiling, sometimes closing her eyes, as if continuing a dream she refused to let end. Years passed. Wars rose and fell. New kings ascended and faded. Monuments were built and crumbled. But she remained, not aging as the world did, but becoming part of that place, like roots sunk deep into remembrance. They say if you place your hand upon the statue's chest, upon Apollo's marble heart, you will feel a faint pulse, like the final echo of a god's heartbeat, or perhaps the breath of a love, still alive. One night, the full moon arrived later than usual. A winter wind swept gently through the forest, carrying the scent of charred wood and thyme. Leonthi arrived as she always did. But this time, she brought nothing. No cushion, no cloak, only herself. She sat beside him as she had for so many moons. But this time, she leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, never to open them again. The next morning, a woodcutter passed by. He saw her sitting there peaceful as if asleep, but her lips were smiling and her hand still rested upon his. They did not touch her. They built no shrine. They simply turned away in silence. And so the stories spread further, that when the moon is full and the wind stands still, one might see a swan flying low across the lake, not to be seen, but to remember. For there are loves that need no words, no endings, only presence. And Leonthi, once a warrior, had finally found where she belonged beside a god turned to stone, whose heart had never gone cold. The Spartans never recorded Leonthi's name in their chronicles. They built no statues in her honor, painted no images of her on clay vases, and sang no songs to remember her. In their world, a warrior lived on only if they died for glory. But Leonthi did not die in war. She died for love. And love to Sparta was always a luxury, something permitted only after victory, never as a force that could lead someone away from the ranks. And so her name vanished from the records, but not from the memory of the land. They say that after the final full moon night, when she was found leaning against the statue of Apollo, the forest never returned to the way it had been. The trees no longer rustled the same. The wind grew quieter, and the lake, which once reflected the moon, now showed only the shape of someone sitting still, even though no one was there. No one touched the statue. No one dared move her body. And strangely, that body did not decay. It looked as though she were sleeping, so peaceful that no one dared call it death. Locals began to call that forest the moon's silence. No one explained why, but anyone who passed through felt smaller, as if stepping into a place where a love too great to forget still lingered. Time went on. The Roman Republic rose. Greek temples crumbled into rubble. Then came those who bore the cross, tearing down the names of old gods and raising new commandments. But there was one place they did not disturb. the moon's silence. They did not know why, only that when they entered their voices felt too loud. Centuries later, a poet passed through, and for reasons he could not explain, he wept. He left behind a single verse carved hurriedly into stone. There are those who love without being loved in return. There are sacred things that need no miracles. And then he left, like everyone else. Now you might ask, why tell this story? A warrior falls in love with a god and turns to stone beside him. What does that matter to us people living among skyscrapers, internet signals, and American dreams? I will not answer, but I will invite you to wonder. How many of us have had to choose between what we were taught and what we truly feel? How many have loved something, a person, a purpose, a dream, knowing we would lose it and chose to love it anyway? How many in this loud and hurried age would sit beside what we lost, not crying out, not cursing fate, but simply be there like Leonthe? She did not resist Sparta with violence. She did not beg the gods to change her fate. She simply chose not to leave. She stayed beside the one she loved, in silence. And sometimes staying is not weakness. It is the bravest act of all. Here in America, where we are taught that success means moving forward, that feelings must be tamed by reason, that only victory is worth remembering. Leonthe's story may seem like a paradox, but perhaps it is the paradox we need. Because sometimes the most beautiful thing is not in winning, but in the full presence of someone who loves what they cannot keep. Because perhaps you do not need your name written in history to become immortal. You only need to love deeply enough that your love outlives you. Now, if one night you find yourself unable to sleep and you step outside standing beneath the moon, try being silent for a long while. And if you are lucky, you might feel something brush through your heart like the wings of a swan flying through centuries, just to remind you, to love sometimes is not to possess, only to remember. We have traveled together through this story, not to understand myth, but to understand the human soul. And now, as Leonthe once did, close your eyes for a moment, and let the silence lead you to where your heart has never dared to go. Let me tell you an old story, a story that cannot be found in any textbook, one that does not begin with the sound of gunfire or the grandeur of a coronation, but with the steady clatter of iron wheels rolling along damp tracks, the howling wind slipping through the cracks of the train car doors, and the silent eyes of those who refused to look back. There was a time not so long ago, just over a century back, when people began to leave. Not individuals, but families. Clusters of people, entire small communities. They left behind the damp countryside haunted by the ghosts of the post-slavery era from Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. They did not leave because it was migration season. They left behind cotton fields and rickety wooden shacks because they simply could not endure it any longer. That night, someone packed everything into a trembling suitcase bound with twine. A child slept on a pile of clothes while its mother shielded it from the cold wind blowing through a gap in the train car. A man sat upright for the entire journey, clutching a faded photograph of a father who had once been lynched for staring too long at a white person. No one cried. No one sang. There was only the grinding sound of the train echoing through the earth, the sound of a departure without farewell. They left the South. They left behind Jim Crow, those strangling laws like ropes around the neck. They left behind the contemptuous stares, the police stations that never stood on their side, and the sleepless nights filled with the terror of a knock on the door at midnight. They headed north, drawn by a rumor. There is work, there are homes, there is freedom. From 1910 to 1930, more than 1 million Black Americans left the rural South. History calls it the Great Migration. But for those who stepped off the trains in Chicago, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, it was simply a chance to breathe. There was a place unexpected, unpredictable, that became a spark in the darkness. Harlem, the upper corner of Manhattan, New York. At first, Harlem was built to welcome middle-class white residents. But when the real estate bubble burst at the start of the 20th century, those homes stood cold and empty. And then Black families from the southern countryside began to move in, not because they were invited, but because they had nowhere else to go. Yet amid the crowding, the scarcity, and the uncertainty, Harlem began to transform. Just imagine this. You are walking down a narrow street, barely 10 feet wide at dusk. On one side, a laundromat. On the other, a barber shop. Ahead, a small cafe with the faint whisper of a saxophone seeping through the cracks in the door. Here, within just a few cramped blocks, you would find everything a once silenced community needed to find its voice. Doctors, tailors, painters, poets, preachers, jazz musicians. Here you could listen to a sermon in the morning, then by evening hear the trumpet wailing from a bar's basement. You might see a young boy with a rusted horn trying to mimic Louis Armstrong. A brown-skinned girl in a floral dress holding a book of Langston Hughes's poetry. They did not live easily. They were still hungry. They were still discriminated against. But for the first time, they were not living to survive. They were living to express. They were surrounded by their own, those who had once been scattered, now pieced together into a collective mirror. For the first time, many Black Americans felt something unfamiliar yet deeply stirring. This is home. Harlem became a laboratory of identity. Here, music was not just entertainment, it was a way to survive. Jazz did not come from theory books, but from backyards in New Orleans, from the erratic heartbeat of those who had once run for their lives. It traveled with them on the train, not in suitcases, but in their blood. And when it met Harlem, it exploded. Somehow that sound, chaotic, contradictory, sorrowful, yet exuberant, became freedom in the form of rhythm. Jazz did not follow rules. It bent time. It turned pain into melody. It made silence move. Take a walk through Harlem in 1922, and you would hear it, the wail of Bessie Smith's voice through a phonograph, the clumsy blows of a boy trying to mimic Louis Armstrong on the stoop, and if you were lucky or wealthy, you could step into the Cotton Club, where Duke Ellington commanded the piano and the soul of the night. That was Harlem before it was called a Renaissance. A place where people no longer endured with their eyes closed, but began to speak with their eyes wide open. Every note, every painting, every word. Not to reclaim history, but to create a new one. Their own, and all of ours. The music still echoes somewhere. Harlem that night did not sleep, and no one wanted to sleep anymore. And tonight, we are not just walking through the neon-lit streets of Harlem. We are stepping deeper into the soul of a generation. They did not merely create music. They created a new heartbeat for the soul of America. And between those notes, every word, every written page also became music. A kind of music born from anger, from love, from the longing to live as one's true self. There were nights when Harlem needed no moonlight. All it took was the sound of Duke Ellington's trumpet echoing from the end of the street, and the entire neighborhood lit up. Not with floodlights, but with the glow of memories awakening inside the listener. Can you picture that scene? Inside the Cotton Club, a place reserved for white patrons, sipping gin and nodding along to the rhythm, a black man sat at the piano. His fingers touched the keys, not as if playing, but as if conversing. A wordless dialogue between him and something more sacred than applause. That was Ellington, the man who did not compose to follow the times, but to lead them. His music was like a moving painting. In it, brass instruments could cry, drums could breathe, saxophones could whisper. Each sound emerged from an unfinished dream, the dreams of a father who had lost his job of a mother, packing rice for her child with cracked hands. Jazz did not conceal the wounds it rose from the deepest pain. And yet, within that pain, it found a strange kind of joy. A joy strong enough to make people rise and dance, even if they did not know what they would eat the next morning. But if music is the heartbeat, then words are the voice of the soul. At a corner table in a bar, a young man was writing something on a napkin. Not a menu, not a love note, but a poem. Langston Hughes was still just a young man then, but each of his lines felt written in the blood of 1,000 ancestors. He wrote with the silence of a doorman, with the sigh of a dancer late at night, with the fragile dream of those who were never allowed to dream big. In The Negro Speaks of Rivers, Hughes did not just write about rivers. He wrote about the flow of identity from the Nile to the Mississippi, where every drop carried memory. He did not write to earn applause. He wrote so no one else could speak in his place. There was also Claude McKay, whose voice cut straight into the heart of society like a blade. In If We Must Die, he did not plead, he declared war, not with guns, but with words. Each verse was a blow not filled with hatred, but with dignity. And then there was Zora Neale Hurston, the woman who carried the entire South within her. She did not write like a scholar. She wrote like someone who had lived, who had listened, who once held her grandmother's hand while stories were told of spirits of snakes that could sing of long rainy days in Eatonville. She turned spoken language into literature, unpolished, unpainted, keeping it just as it was. In their eyes were watching God. Zora did not have her characters find their voices through love, but through loss, through land, and finally through themselves. It was not just a novel. It was the journey of a soul from silence to speech. You see, Harlem, then, was not just filled with music. It was filled with words, and those words knew how to rebel. Living rooms turned into literary salons. There were no armchairs or fine wine, but there were manuscripts read aloud under the whir of ceiling fans. There were debates, arguments, tears. And there was doubt. Are we going too far? But then someone would say, no, we are finally going the right way. The crisis opportunity. Black magazines, each printed page like a drumbeat rising from the earth. They did not wait for an invitation. They opened the door with their own pens. And among the many voices, there was one question that quietly wove its way through every paragraph, every lyric, every brushstroke. What does it mean to be black in America? No one had a single answer. Some wrote with love, some with rage. Some stitched it into lullabies. Others forged it into manifestos. But none of them stayed silent, because they knew if they did not tell their story, someone else would rewrite it wrongly. And so that night, in a small apartment that smelled of burnt wood under the faint glow of a yellow light, amidst the haze of smoke and laughter laced with pain, they wrote. They sang. They told stories. Not to become famous, not to be remembered by name, but to hold on to something the world once tried to take away, their own voice. And you know what? That voice even now has never stopped echoing. Imagine this. You are sitting in a small room, the dim yellow light casting shadows across an old wooden table. Outside, snow is quietly falling onto the rooftops of Bern. The clock ticks steadily, and within that seemingly still atmosphere a revolution is quietly being written, not with bullets, but with ink paper and a mind that refused to sleep. Albert Einstein, just 26 years old at the time, was still an unknown clerk working at the Swiss Patent Office. Each day he reviewed patent applications, edited wording, calculated the mechanics of presses, locks, and electrical devices. But each night he entered a different universe. He called it the time to dream with reason. When the city slept, Einstein embarked on a solitary journey into questions no one asked, ideas no one dared to write. And in 1905, the year that would later be known as the Annus Mirabilis, the miracle year, everything came together, exploding like a small bang within the cosmos of thought. 4 papers, just 4, but each was a door to a new world. The first he wrote about a kind of light that had long fascinated him, this time, not as an invisible wave as most believed, but as quanta of light particles. A radical idea at the time. Yet from this quantum mechanics was born a world of particles, uncertainty, and truths that defy intuition. It was for this paper, not the theory of relativity, as many assumed, that he would later receive the Nobel Prize in 1921. For the photoelectric effect, a way of saying that light could be both a wave and a particle. Much like humanity, contradictory, yet real. Then came Brownian motion. Do you remember? Those tiny dust particles dancing in a glass of water under sunlight. Einstein saw in them the proof of a world that could not be seen, a world of atoms, of microscopic chaos, of endless motion. He did not merely describe the phenomenon. He gave it a mathematical soul, a proof that matter truly was made of little things dancing through the universe. And then came the third paper, the one that changed the world forever. In zur Elektrodynamik, bewegter Körper, on the electrodynamics of moving bodies. Einstein proposed an idea that upended all of classical physics, the special theory of relativity. Time was no longer absolute. Space was no longer fixed. Both were elastic, shifting depending on the observer and their velocity. A person sitting still would experience a moment differently from someone flying through the cosmos. Time, that which we had always believed to be constant, objective, and fair, was in fact a stream that listens. And then he ended with a simple equation now known across the world, E equals MC2. 3 characters. 1 equals sign. A command to bend reality. What did it mean? That mass and energy are not separate. That even a tiny amount of mass and atom could unleash enough energy to light up an entire city, or destroy it. At the time, no one paid much attention, but a century later, humanity would come to realize that this little equation was a double-edged sword, a promise, and a warning. The strange thing is, Einstein wrote all of this in solitude. No laboratory, no research team, no academic title or post. Just him, a fountain pen, and a universe in his mind. Each evening, after his wife and children had gone to bed, he would open the window, gaze at the sky, and quietly wonder, what if I were riding on a beam of light? Would time stop? Would the world bend? That question, seemingly childlike, was the first thread in the tapestry of modern physics. Because Einstein, more than anyone else at the time, understood that science does not begin with answers. It begins with wonder. To him, the greatest miracle was not what we know, but that the world can be understood at all. In 1919, during a total solar eclipse, astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington observed starlight bending as it passed near the sun, just as Einstein had predicted. And overnight, Einstein, once dismissed by academia, became a global name. But when reporters came to him, he only shrugged and smiled. I have not changed. People have only just begun to see me. That was the truth, because the world only sees the light when it finally reaches them. And now, more than a century later, every time you hear GPS directions, see a laser beam scan a barcode, or look up at the night sky and wonder where we come from, you are living in Einstein's world, a world that once began. In a small room in Bern, where a quiet man wrote words that would shake the foundations of everything we believed to be unchangeable. If you have ever seen an unmanned ship drifting across a deep black ocean, you may begin to understand what Neo carried with him when he left Africa. It was not an escape, but a kind of disappearance, quiet, without farewell, without a call to return. Only the sea, and the wind, and a faint red streak of sunset, like diluted blood, lingering after the final goodbye to land. He drifted for weeks aboard a freighter no one remembered the name of. Amid crates and rusted chains, Neo did not sleep. He sat knees drawn to his chest by a low-deck window, staring at the ocean, as if willing it to reveal something about the future about himself. Occasionally, an old Filipino sailor played harmonica during the night shift. The melody, mournful, as if echoing from another century, lingered between the engine hum and the salt-laden air. Neo never asked his name. But on the final night, as they departed the port of Southampton, the sailor placed a hand on Neo's shoulder and said, "Some lonelinesses are not meant to be cured, only crossed." London, winter of 1903. A city saturated with smoke and the future. A kind of future that felt cold and dirty, like metal, like cogs grinding against cobblestone streets. No one knew who Neo was, and that gave him a strange kind of freedom, along with a chill that cut to the bone. He wandered fog-draped streets, entered shabby tea-houses, where dock workers gathered, and eventually, as if led by unseen hands, found his way to the Engineering Society in Bloomsbury, where the boldest minds of the age were speaking of electricity, of radio waves, of particles not yet named. And then there were they, the ones who saw Neo. Not because he had invented anything, but because he asked the right questions. Questions like small blades cutting through repetition, through what they called European logic, which they still reveled in. Professor Harris, a physicist and a dreamer, was the first to invite Neo to his home. Over a dinner of roasted meat, root vegetables, and a dry red wine, Harris asked, "Do you believe light can carry memory?" Neo was silent. Then he nodded. "Not just memory," he said, "but pain as well." From that day, Neo was invited to private seminars where they spoke of waves of light of the memory held in matter. He had no degree, no title, but whenever he spoke, the room fell silent. For in his voice was something of the desert not rushed, not needing to be believed, but impossible to ignore. One spring day, when the wind carried the scent of lilacs through the boarding house window, Neo received a letter. The sender, Nikola Tesla. No one knew how Tesla had heard of him, but the letter, handwritten and brief, read, "I heard of you from the lines no one reads. If you come to New York, I believe we should meet. There is a light trying to find its way out of the dark." Neo went to America, not out of hope, but out of instinct. A kind of intuition he trusted more than knowledge. On the steamship crossing the Atlantic, he wrote a single sentence in his notebook. "If light carries memory, perhaps it is searching for the one who once lost it." New York, 1904. The city was like an unfinished jazz composition, chaotic, pungent, and so vividly alive that it gave him headaches. Neo arrived at Tesla's laboratory on East Houston Street. It was not what he had imagined. No glamour, no mystique, just a wide shadowed room filled with spirals of copper tubing, worn filing cabinets, and the crackle of electricity like whispers from an unborn creature. Tesla stood with his back turned, surrounded by a web of wires and flashing arcs of light. He did not look at Neo, only said softly, "I want to ask you something. Do you think sound can exist if no one hears it?" Neo answered, "If the heart vibrates deeply enough, even silence has a wave." Tesla smiled. "Good. Let us begin there." They did not work like scientists. They dreamed. And in their dreams were data equations, failed experiments, and moments when the sparks flickered like souls returning. They spoke of light retaining the image of the departed, of electric waves, piercing memory of the idea that everything leaves a trace, if only we know how to listen at the right frequency. One night, Neo sat alone in the dark laboratory, watching his shadow stretch beneath the violet glow of Tesla's coil. He wondered, if I disappeared right now, would the world tremble at a strange frequency Tesla entered and placed a hand on his shoulder, just like the sailor once had? We were not born to be famous. We are here to keep the flame alive for those who will come after. And so, Neo began to touch something no one else dared to believe, a kind of memory made of light. He did not own it. He did not invent it. But he became the bridge, a guide, a silent marker on the map of science and soul. He was no longer a wandering African man. He was an essential link between past and future, between science and memory, between silence and echo. But Neo knew, before light could be held, he would have to face the darkness within himself. And it was coming like a storm with no warning. Do you hear it? Not the wind outside the window, not the low hum of the air conditioner, but a sound so faint, like the breathing of memory. A sound buried somewhere in old reels of tape in faded, flickering documentaries that only the night has the patience to rewind. It is the voice of an era cracking open, and Neo once again stands at the crossroads of fate. 1950. The Cold War was no longer a whisper in embassy hallways. It had roared to life. The 38th parallel, the line dividing the Korean peninsula, had become a living scar. And as if once again, caught in the relentless gears of history, Neo was summoned. No longer the blue-uniformed soldier from Normandy. Now he was a symbol, though he had never chosen to be. When he stepped onto the soil of Busan, Korea, where refugees crowded beneath silver tarp shelters, Neo said nothing for 17 minutes. He only looked. Children shivering in torn sweaters. Women cradling bowls of thin porridge, their eyes red from crying. And soldiers far too young wiping their rifles as if trying to soothe a restless child. Neo suddenly remembered the smell of ash from the trenches of France, a scent no soap could ever wash away. He was assigned an unofficial task escort, a group of civilian journalists and doctors, through unsafe zones to document refugee conditions. The mission sounded harmless. But Neo knew in a place where bombs fell like summer rain, and the line between soldier and civilian blurred like morning mist, nothing was truly harmless. The journey lasted 3 days. In a rickety truck covered in camouflage netting, they traveled over scorched hills where dry grass crackled like straw, and sometimes bodies lay motionless like stones. A boy no more than 12 ran alongside the truck for half an hour, saying nothing, only watching Neo. When the truck turned up a mountain path, Neo looked back. The boy was gone. But that gaze, cold stern, as if demanding an explanation, stayed with him the rest of that afternoon. On the second night, they rested in a bombed-out school. Neo met a man, a philosophy professor from Seoul, once a student in France. He quietly sipped black coffee brewed in a soldier's canteen and said, "You know, in war, the first thing to lose is the word, language, when a child no longer knows what to call father, when homeland becomes something you must flee from." Neo did not answer. But he remembered a soldier in Bastogne once said nearly the same thing in German. On the final morning, they were ambushed. North Korean forces shelled them from a western ridge while a sniper hid in the rubble behind the old church. Within 3 minutes, an Italian reporter fell. Gunfire turned into screaming bones, cracking time, stopping. Neo pulled a female doctor into a shelter. His hands were covered in blood he did not know whose, and for a moment the memories of Normandy came rushing back. The waves, the screaming, the scent of burning metal. They survived. But Neo was no longer the Neo of Paris or of Bastogne. He grew quieter, as if this war had not killed him, but emptied him of every sound inside. When they returned to Tokyo, the logistics hub, he refused to celebrate. That night, in a damp hotel room, Neo stared out at the Tokyo streets where bicycles glided silently through the rain, and for the first time, he wept. Not from fear, but from the feeling that he could no longer hold on to anything. No one, no word, no dream. People asked, why would a man like that, a hero, choose to keep stepping into humanity's grayest places? The answer is not in textbooks. It lies in a place much deeper where Neo was not a symbol, but simply a man who had survived too many times to believe in anything easy. He wrote a letter to an old friend in New York. "I do not think I am fighting to win. I am just trying to keep something, however fragile, from disappearing completely." Perhaps that was Neo's true legacy. Not medals, not headlines, but a will that refused to let memory vanish, no matter how painful it was. You see, history is not the story of the powerful. It is the story of those who, though wounded, still carry the past on their backs as a gentle reminder that we were once human. And Neo in silence keeps walking through the twilight of a century that has yet to rest. It is late. The wind outside brushes gently through the thin curtain, as if whispering to anyone still awake. Are you listening? Because now we are approaching the final chapter, not where stories end, but where they quietly turn into memory. Neo by now no longer just a man, a character, or a fragment of history. He has become a pause, a silence between two eras, between faith and doubt, between ideals and betrayal, between the light of dreams and the darkness of reality. He never became a leader, never built an empire, never seized power. And because of that, he lives on in the souls that were once stirred by his gaze, by a voice that never shouted, but was always heard. After the final upheaval, when Neo's letter was sealed, its words never reaching their intended destination, he chose to step away from the world. Not out of fear, but because he understood there are truths that can only survive in silence. Some say he left the city traveling to the northern plains where winters are long and quiet like a prayer. Others believe he still lives within the heart of the city, beneath the guise of an ordinary man blending into the crowd, not to be remembered, but so as not to be forgotten. And then one day, those who had once heard him speak, debated with him, opposed or loved him, found themselves repeating the very words he had once said. Not because they believed, but because they could no longer deny the feeling that he had been right. About the breaking, about human nature, about a future not built on power, but on choice. Brave choices, often small, often lonely, but never surrendering. Those who once tried to silence him had grown old. They lay awake in lit mansions where no mirror could reflect the past. Meanwhile, the story of Neo began to be told again, not in books or headlines, but by firelight in quiet circles where people whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone like him not to lead, but to remind. And so, from a man erased, Neo became a symbol that needed no statue. No one knows where he is buried if he died. No one knows what his voice sounded like if you never heard it. But everyone knows if anything was worth keeping from that chaotic time, it was the spirit of Neo. Unbowed, unresentful, never using violence to overcome violence, never letting hatred devour the truth. Dear friend, perhaps you are sitting in a small apartment in a modern city with car lights flickering through the curtains, your phone buzzing with breaking news. But if you close your eyes and listen closely, can you hear footsteps in the snow? It could be Neo. Or perhaps it is you carrying an untold story, a silence that matters, a choice that only you can make. This story, in the end, is not about a hero. It is about all of us, those who can choose to hold on to the light, even when the world calls out the name of darkness. And now, as the night grows deeper, if you are still awake, hold on to this history never repeats itself, but it always leaves an echo long enough, quiet enough, for those who know how to listen. Sleep well. Neo is still there, in you, in me, in every moment that needs a gentle reminder that this world can still be healed not by a roar, but by one deep, honest breath.